What would you do if your mother vanished into thin air and every single person you begged for help looked right through you like you didn't exist? An 11-year-old boy standing alone in a storm, a crumpled card, a name he barely recognized, and a door that should have terrified him, but was the only door left in the world still willing to open. This is the story of Eli Mercer, a kid who fell through every crack the system had, and the broken, scarred, dangerous men who caught him anyway. Stay with us all the way to the end because this one hits different. If this story moves you, hit that like button, drop a comment, tell us what city you're watching from tonight. Let's go. The storm came in off the ridge like something with a grudge. It didn't build slow the way most November storms did in Harlan County. It just arrived. Black sky, cracked open, rain hammering every surface flat and sideways. The kind of cold that didn't care about your jacket or your reasons for being outside. The kind that found the gaps in things. Found the places where warmth had already been leaking out for a long time. Eli Mercer had been walking for 40 minutes. He was 11 years old and small for it. His sneakers soaked through to the skin of his feet. His gray hoodie pressed against his chest like a second layer of cold. He carried a backpack with one functioning strap, and inside it he had a granola bar he'd already crushed by gripping the bag too hard, a dead phone, and a plastic sleeve he kept under his shirt to keep dry. Inside the sleeve was a single index card, laminated with a strip of packing tape his mother had put over it carefully, almost carefully enough, the edges already peeling at one corner. He'd read the card so many times in the last 48 hours that he didn't need to look at it anymore. Rainer Vale, Iron Vultures MC. If something happens to me, if I'm not home and you can't reach anyone, go here. An address on Depot Road. And his mother's handwriting, which he knew better than his own, which he'd watched write grocery lists and birthday cards and his excuse notes for school, and which now felt like a fist closing around something inside his chest he couldn't name. She'd written it 6 months ago. He'd found it taped to the back of the kitchen cabinet beside the sink, behind the box of baking soda she'd told him was for smells, but which had never once been opened. He'd asked her about it back then, casually, the way kids ask questions they know are bigger than casual. She'd gone quiet for a second, then she'd said, "It's just in case. You'll never need it." He was on Depot Road now. The Iron Vultures clubhouse sat back from the road behind a chain-link fence with a rusted gate, flanked on both sides by dead grass and gravel. 3 motorcycles sat under a corrugated aluminum overhang, beaded with rain. A hand-painted sign above the door, black letters on raw wood flaking at the edges, read, Iron Vultures. Below it, stenciled in red that had faded to the color of old brick, members only. Every light in the building was on. He could hear voices, low music, the specific thick hum of a room full of men who were not being quiet because they were peaceful, but because they were comfortable in their own silence together. Eli stood at the gate for a long time. He thought about turning back. He thought about the social worker whose voicemail he'd called 3 times, whose office he'd sat outside for 2 hours on Tuesday before someone told him she was on leave. He thought about the Harlan County Police Department's front desk officer, who had looked at him with the specific expression of someone calculating how quickly they could redirect a situation towards someone else's desk. He thought about his aunt in Knoxville who had listened for 4 minutes on the phone before saying she was sure Vivian would turn up, that his mother had always been scattered, that he should try not to worry. Scattered, like his mother was a misplaced set of keys. He pushed the gate open. The gravel was loud under his sneakers. He walked to the door and knocked, and the knocking felt stupid against the noise inside. So he knocked harder, the way he'd seen adults knock when they meant it, flat-palmed and deliberate. The music dropped a notch. He heard footsteps. The door opened and the man who filled it was not what Eli had expected, though he couldn't have said exactly what he'd expected. The man was tall, but the height wasn't the thing. It was the density of him, the way he took up space without trying. He had a face that looked like it had been broken once and healed on its own terms, a jaw that had seen fists, a nose that had been reset imperfectly. His hair was close-cropped, gray at the temples, and he had the kind of eyes that cataloged a situation before the rest of him decided how to respond to it. He wore a leather vest over a dark flannel shirt, the patches on the vest faded but legible. A skull with wings. The name below it in arc letters, Grim. He looked at Eli. Not through him, at him. That was the first thing Eli noticed, that this man actually looked at him. "You're soaked," the man said. His voice was the same temperature as the rest of him, low, not unkind, carrying something that had been trained out of warmth over time, but hadn't quite made it all the way to cold. Eli pulled the index card out from under his shirt, held it up. His hand was trembling, though he'd been trying to stop that since he turned off Belmont Street. The man looked at the card. Something moved across his face, small, careful, impossible to read fully. He stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside," he said. "I'm Chet." The clubhouse smelled like a specific combination of things Eli would later, years later, be unable to separate. Motor oil and whiskey, the ghost of cigarette smoke soaked into wood paneling, wet leather warming up near a space heater, coffee that had been sitting in a pot too long. The light was amber and low, hanging bare bulbs over a long table and a bar-style counter along one wall. A flat screen in the corner played a football game on mute. Playing cards sat face down at 3 positions around the table, games paused. 5 men. 2 more women. A dog of indeterminate breed sleeping in the corner with the focused intensity of something that had decided sleep was its occupation. All of them looked at Eli, not with suspicion exactly, but with the quiet assessment of people who had learned that surprises were neutral until proven otherwise. Eli had walked into rooms like this before, rooms full of adult attention, and always felt it as a kind of weight. But this weight was different. It didn't feel like judgment. It felt like calibration. "Kid came in off the storm," Grim said to the room. He didn't elaborate. He pulled a chair out from the table and looked at Eli. "Sit down before you fall down." Eli sat. One of the women, compact, dark-haired, with a constellation of small scars along her left forearm that she didn't hide, set a mug of coffee in front of him without asking. Not coffee exactly. She'd added something, milk or creamer, enough to make it the color of tea. He wrapped both hands around it, and the heat was almost painful in his fingers. "Nova," she said, by way of introduction. Or maybe just by way of being a person in a room who had a name. He said his. Grim had pulled a chair around and sat in it, reversed, arms crossed over the back, watching Eli with that same cataloging expression. "How old are you?" 11? "Where'd you get that card?" "My mom left it, in the kitchen, taped behind a cabinet." "When?" "Like 6 months ago, but I only looked for it 2 days ago." He paused. "After she didn't come home." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when everyone in them decides at the same moment to pay close attention. "How long?" Grim said. 4 days. Eli's voice held. He'd been practicing holding it. "She works nights at Blackwater Ridge Manor. It's a nursing facility out on Route 9. She was supposed to get off at 6 a.m. Thursday and come home. She didn't. I waited until Friday morning, then I called her phone, then I called the facility. They said she'd checked out early, that she'd resigned." He stopped. "She didn't resign." "How do you know?" "Because she told me 3 weeks ago she was scared of losing her job. Because we need that job. Because she'd never resign without telling me. Never. Not even if—" He stopped himself again. Set the mug down. "She didn't resign. Something happened." Grim looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that isn't deciding whether to believe you. It's deciding something else. Something about what believing you costs. "You went to the police," he said. It wasn't really a question. "Friday afternoon." The bitterness in Eli's voice surprised him when he heard it. How adult it sounded. "The officer at the desk said adults have the right to leave. Said she'd probably show up. Said to come back after 72 hours. He pulled at the sleeve of his soaked hoodie. "I went back Monday. A different officer this time. He filled out a report. He looked at me the whole time like he was filling out paperwork for someone else's problem." Nobody in the room said anything about that. They didn't need to. Several of them had the look of people who had stood on the other side of exactly that kind of desk and received exactly that kind of attention. "Social worker?" Nova asked. 3 voicemails. Her supervisor called back once, said they were looking into it. That was yesterday. I haven't heard anything since. "Family?" "My aunt in Knoxville. She thinks my mom went somewhere to clear her head. Eli kept his voice flat. He'd learned in the last 4 days that if he kept it flat, it didn't crack. My grandparents are both gone. There's nobody else. Grim stood up. He walked to the bar counter and poured himself 2 fingers of something amber, then stood there not drinking it, staring at the counter. The room waited for him. That was its own kind of information, that these people, some of them clearly more experienced than each other, all oriented toward this man without needing to be asked to. "You've been alone in that house for 4 days," Grim said, still facing the counter. "Yes." "Eaten what?" The question was so mundane and so specific that it cracked something open in Eli's chest that he hadn't been managing well. He swallowed. "There was stuff in the pantry. I've been fine." Grim turned around. "That's not what I asked." Eli stared at the table. "Cereal and the granola bar." He paused. "I've been fine." A man at the far end of the table stood up without ceremony and disappeared through a doorway behind the bar. Eli heard the sounds of a refrigerator, a cabinet, a pan hitting a stove burner. Nobody acknowledged this. It was just a thing that was happening because it needed to happen, as natural and unremarkable as weather. Well, 40 minutes later, Eli had eaten scrambled eggs and half a piece of toast and given them everything he had: the timeline, the name of the facility, his mother's shift schedule, the name of the floor supervisor she'd mentioned twice in the past month. Vivian Mercer, age 34, CNA license, 4 years at Blackwater Ridge. Never late, never absent, never the kind of person who left. What he didn't know how to convey, what he'd been trying to hand to every adult he'd spoken to in the last 4 days and watched them set back down, was the quality of her absence, the specific wrongness of a house where someone was supposed to be, the way the kitchen still smelled faintly like the shampoo she used, the way her coffee cup was still in the dish rack, washed and set out to dry for the morning she hadn't come home for. He didn't try to explain it to these people. He didn't have to. Nova had pulled out a laptop and was already moving through something with focused quiet. The man who'd cooked, broad-shouldered, a tattoo of a compass rose on the side of his neck, who'd been introduced to nobody as anything but who Grim called Trace, had written down everything Eli said on a yellow legal pad, his handwriting fast and dense. A heavy-set man named Porkchop, a name delivered with complete seriousness, had disappeared into a back room and returned with a binder full of printed county records, which didn't entirely explain how he had those or why they were already organized. Grim sat across from Eli again. He set Vivian's index card on the table between them, face up. "I need to know how she knew my name," he said. Eli looked at the card. "I don't know. She never talked about you. I didn't even know your name before I read that." "She ever mentioned the club?" "No, I don't think so." He hesitated. "Maybe. She used to say sometimes that there were people in this county who actually watched out for things. That not everybody who looked dangerous was the problem." He paused. "I thought she just meant... I don't know what I thought she meant." Grim picked up the card, held it, set it back down. "How long she been at Blackwater Ridge?" 4 years, since I was 7. Before that she worked at a hospital in Corbin, but we moved after my dad left." He'd gotten good at delivering that part as a fact. Just a fact. "She said the shift differential was better at Blackwater. Nights paid more." "She ever say anything about the place? Problems, complaints?" Eli thought. "She said it felt corporate, like they cared about how things looked more than how they actually ran. She said the documentation was always... She said they were always pushing the CNAs to sign off faster than was accurate. On the care logs." He looked up. "I don't know exactly what that means." "It means the records don't match the care being given," Nova said quietly, not looking up from the laptop. "It's a billing thing. If you can make it look like a patient received more services than they did, you can charge more to Medicare, to families." She paused. "It's also the kind of thing that buries other problems." "What kind of other problems?" Nova glanced at Grim. Something passed between them, fast, directional, decided. "Let us look at a few things," Grim said. "You need to sleep. I know you're not tired. You're running on adrenaline and whatever's been keeping you moving for 4 days and you don't want to stop because stopping means sitting with it. He said it without cruelty, just as a statement of observed fact. There's a cot in the back room. It's not fancy. Nobody's going to lock a door on you, and we're going to keep working. Eli looked at him. How did you know my mom? Grim was quiet for a moment. She did night shifts at a facility where some of our guys get their physicals done. VA-connected place, not Blackwater Ridge. Different one. She caught something irregular with one of our members' prescriptions about 3 years ago. Flagged it. Made some calls, probably saved his kidney function. He paused. She didn't have to do that. She wasn't his nurse. She just noticed. Another pause. She left a contact card with him in case he ever needed anything. He passed it to me. I passed my name back to her in case she ever needed the same. Eli stared at the card on the table. His mother's handwriting, just in case. You'll never need it. She wrote that card 6 months ago, he said, before I knew she was scared. I know. Which means she's been scared longer than I knew. Grim didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The answer was in the lamination on that index card, in the packing tape carefully pressed over every edge. Eli slept for 3 hours. He didn't intend to. He lay on the cot in the back room while the muffled sounds of the clubhouse moved through the wall. The low voices, the keyboard clicks, boots on wood, a phone call conducted in near whispers, and told himself he was just resting his eyes. When he woke, it was past midnight and the storm had moved off, left behind a cold that settled into everything. He pulled on his still damp hoodie and walked back out to the main room. Nova was at the table alone, a half-empty coffee mug beside her, papers spread out, the laptop open to something dense with text. She looked up when he came in, didn't tell him to go back to sleep. Sit down if you want. He sat. She turned the laptop screen slightly toward him so he could see what she was looking at. A state health department website, inspection records for Blackwater Ridge Manor going back 7 years. Your mom worked there 4 years, Nova said. In that same 4 years, how many compliance complaints do you think were filed? He had no frame of reference. A lot? 14. That's a lot. But here's the thing. She pointed at the screen. Only 2 of them resulted in any documented response. The other 12 are listed as resolved with no findings. She looked at him. Do you know what that means? That they said nothing was wrong. That somebody said nothing was wrong. There's a difference. She tapped the screen. 7 of those 12 complaints came from current or former employees. 3 from family members of residents. And they all landed in the same place, resolved, no findings, every time. You think someone's covering for them. I think someone's been paid to cover for them, which is different from random corruption. It means the problem is organized. Eli stared at the inspection records. How long have you been doing this? Which part? This, looking for things other people want hidden. Nova picked up her coffee. Long enough to know what organized concealment looks like versus regular incompetence. She set it back down. Your mom, had she said anything specific recently? Not just that the documentation felt off, specific. He thought about the 3 weeks she'd been anxious. The way she'd been quiet at dinner, eating without tasting. The way she'd checked her phone too often and explained it away each time. She said she found something she shouldn't have. She didn't tell me what. She said she was figuring out what to do about it. Nova went very still. She say when she found it? About a month ago, maybe 5 weeks. Nova looked at the screen, then back at him. Her expression was controlled in the specific way of someone managing the temperature of what they know before deciding how much heat to release. 3 weeks before your mom disappeared, she said slowly, a different Blackwater Ridge employee, a medication technician named Daniel Weiss, also stopped showing up for work. The official record says he resigned. She paused. His wife called the county police twice. Both calls are logged as welfare check requests. No follow-up on file. The cold in the room felt different now, less like weather and more like something with intention. 2 people, Eli said, at minimum. He looked at her. What were they hiding? Nova closed the laptop, opened it again, closed it. It was the only uncertain movement he'd seen from her since he'd walked in the door. I don't know yet, she said, but whatever it is, It's big enough that making 2 employees disappear was easier than risking them talking. The space heater in the corner ticked and hummed. Outside, a motorcycle engine turned over somewhere down the road, idled, went quiet. Nova stared at the papers on the table with the focused distance of someone running a calculation they hadn't finished yet. Eli thought about his mother's hands, the way she dried them on a dish towel after washing up, thoroughly, because her knuckles cracked in winter if she didn't. The way she always looked at him twice when she was leaving for a shift, once at the door, once over her shoulder from the porch. "She's alive," he said. He said it not like a hope, but like a decision. Nova looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think so too." "Why?" Because whatever they're protecting, they'd only take that kind of risk to keep it quiet if the people who knew about it were still a liability. And people aren't a liability once they're... She stopped. They keep people around as long as silence is still something they can enforce. That sentence was the most frightening thing anyone had said to him in 4 days. It was also, somehow, the closest thing to hope he'd been handed, because it meant there was still time. Grimm appeared from the hallway then, carrying his own coffee, his eyes carrying the specific alertness of someone who hadn't slept either. He looked at the papers, at Nova, at Eli. "Porkchop found something," he said. "The Manor's transport records, the ones they file with the county for patient transfers." "And?" 6 patient transfers in the last 4 months. 3 different receiving facilities listed. He set his coffee down. 2 of those facilities don't exist, not in any registry, not licensed, not anything. Nova sat forward. "Phantom facilities." "Phantom facilities," he looked at Eli. "I need you to think hard. Your mother. Did she ever mention patient transfers? Residents being moved?" Eli thought. Something moved at the edge of his memory. A dinner 3 weeks ago, Vivian picking at her food, saying something half under her breath that he'd only half caught. He'd been looking at his phone. What had she said? Something about the paperwork not matching, something about a name, a patient's name, that showed up on a transfer log, but who she'd been giving medications to that same morning, the same day. How could someone be transferred out of a facility the same morning they were still in their room receiving medication? She said a patient's name was on a transfer form the same day she gave them their morning meds, Eli said. She thought it was a filing error. She was going to ask the administrator about it. Grimm and Nova looked at each other. "She asked the administrator," Nova said. "It wasn't a question." "And 3 weeks later she was gone," Grimm finished. The space heater ticked. The dog in the corner shifted in its sleep and went still again. Somewhere in the back, boots moved across a floor and a chair scraped, and the muffled voices of men who didn't sleep when there was work to do carried through the walls of a clubhouse that had just, without ceremony, decided it was going to war. Eli wrapped his hands around the cold coffee mug and said nothing. He didn't need to. The thing inside his chest that had been locked down for 4 days, the thing that had kept him walking through a storm to a door he was terrified to knock on, had finally found somewhere to put itself. Not hope exactly. Something harder than hope. The specific grinding certainty that the people in this room were not going to look through him. They were going to look with him. And somewhere behind a filing error and phantom paperwork, and 2 employees who'd asked the wrong question, his mother was waiting for someone to find the right one. He just had to make sure they found it in time. The morning came in gray and indifferent, the way mornings do when they don't care what happened the night before. Eli woke on the cot again. He'd gone back to it somewhere around 3 a.m. when his eyes had stopped focusing on Nova's screen, and lay still for a moment listening to the sounds of the clubhouse recalibrating itself for daylight. Boots on wood, water running, the thick gurgle of a coffee maker working through its second cycle. Somewhere outside, a Harley turned over once, coughed, turned over again and caught, settling into that low, uneven idle that sounded less like a machine and more like something alive deciding whether to stay. He stared at the ceiling and made himself run the facts. His mother had been gone 5 days now. 5 days since the morning shift at Blackwater Ridge Manor that she'd never come home from. 5 days since her phone had gone to voicemail and stayed there. 5 days since someone at that facility had told a county police dispatcher that Vivian Mercer had resigned voluntarily, had packed her things, had said her goodbyes, had walked out. A story so complete and so tidy that it could only have been prepared in advance. Nobody resigned without telling their 11-year-old son. Nobody. He got up and folded the blanket with the automatic precision of someone whose mother had taught him that you put things back the way you found them. Then he walked out into the main room. Grim was at the table with Trace and a man Eli hadn't been introduced to yet. Lean, maybe 50, with close-cropped white hair and the kind of stillness that suggested he'd spent a long time in places where stillness was a survival skill. He had a laptop open and a phone face down beside it, and a cup of coffee he'd barely touched. When Eli walked in, this man looked at him with a brief, measuring assessment that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't warm either. "Milo," the man said. Not his name offered voluntarily, more like a label applied for function. Trace looked up from the yellow legal pad. "Kid, you eat anything?" "Not yet." "There's eggs again, or cereal if you want to make your own." "I'm fine." "That phrase is getting a lot of work in this building," Trace said. Grim was staring at something on Milo's laptop screen. He hadn't looked up when Eli came in, but he was aware of him. Eli had already learned that about this man, that the absence of his attention was not the same as inattention. "Come look at this," he said. Eli walked around the table. The screen showed a county property records page, a satellite map pulled up alongside it. A large parcel on the eastern edge of Route 9, the side of the road that backed up against the ridge. The main building of Blackwater Ridge Manor was labeled, a long, low structure in an L shape with a parking lot along its southern face. But behind it, where the property line ran toward the tree line, there was a secondary structure, smaller. No label. "That's the maintenance annex," Milo said. According to the county building permits from 2019, it was approved as a utility and storage facility. HVAC equipment, medical supply storage. He pointed at something in the permit text. "But look at the square footage." Eli looked. He wasn't an expert in building permits and said so. 4,200 square feet, Milo said, for storage and HVAC. He let that sit. The main administrative building of this facility, the one that houses 112 patients, a full nursing staff, medication rooms, administrative offices, is 11,000 square feet. "That's a big storage room," Eli said. "Way too big." Milo closed the tab, opened another. The building permit was approved in March 2019. Construction completed that August. The inspector who signed off on final approval retired 3 months later. He paused. At 51 years old. The room was quiet. "Retired on what?" Trace asked. "That's a good question." Milo turned the laptop slightly. "His disclosed pension payout doesn't explain the house he bought in Gatlinburg." Grim finally looked up. He looked at Eli, and the look had something in it that Eli had started to recognize. Not pity, something harder and more practical. The look of someone calculating how much of a difficult truth to hand to someone they've decided is capable of handling it. "The annex," Grim said. "We think it's connected to the phantom transfer facilities. We think whatever's happening with those patients isn't them being transferred out. We think they're being held on site." Eli heard that sentence and sat down in the nearest chair, because his legs made that decision before his brain had finished processing the words. "Why?" he said. "Insurance fraud at minimum," Nova said from across the room. She'd apparently been there the whole time, sitting sideways in a chair by the window with a phone in her hand. You transfer a patient on paper to a facility that doesn't exist, you can keep billing Medicare or private insurance for their care. Ghost billing. It's been done before. She paused. But ghost billing alone doesn't explain why you'd need a real secondary structure. You could run that scheme with nothing but paperwork. "So there's something else," Eli said. "There's something else. Something that requires a building and requires it to be hidden." Nobody answered that directly. They didn't have to. The answer was assembling itself in front of him from pieces he wished he couldn't connect, and the connecting was happening whether he wanted it to or not. His mother had found a patient's name on a transfer form the same morning she'd given that patient their medication. She'd asked the administrator about it. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Along with Daniel Weiss, the medication technician who'd apparently also found something he shouldn't have. Whatever was in that annex, it was worth making two people disappear to protect. The fight started at 10:15 in the morning. Eli wasn't entirely surprised by it. He'd been feeling the pressure building since he'd woken up, something underneath the professionalism of what was happening in this room, a disagreement that was too large to stay subterranean much longer. It was a man named Briggs who started it. Briggs had arrived around 9 with 2 cups of gas station coffee and a hard expression, wearing a vest identical to the others except older, more scarred. The patches on his chest faded to the point of almost illegibility. He was maybe 40, with the build of someone who'd done physical work his whole life, and the eyes of someone who'd learned that caring about things was a liability. He'd sat across from Eli and looked at him with the open assessment of someone who hadn't been present for the decision to let him in and wasn't sure it had been the right one. "You talked to anyone before you came here?" Briggs asked. He directed the question at Eli, but his eyes moved to Grim as he asked it. "No." "Nobody knows you're here?" "No." "What about at school?" "I've been absent." Eli met the man's eyes steadily. "I was trying to find my mother." "Teachers call the house?" "Probably." I didn't answer. Briggs sat back. "So there's an 11-year-old who's been absent from school for 5 days and nobody's done a welfare check." He addressed this to the room as much as to Eli. "I told you," Eli said. "Nobody cares. School's going to care eventually. They're going to call someone. Someone's going to come looking." He looked at Grim. "We've got law enforcement attention we don't need right now." "Let me handle that," Nova said. "You can't handle a truancy visit from a school counselor who decides to escalate." "I said I'll handle it." Briggs' jaw tightened. "That's not—" "Briggs." Grim's voice was level, not raised. It didn't need to be. "That's enough. I'm not saying the kid isn't—" He stopped, started again. "I'm saying we've got a situation here that's got layers we haven't finished mapping yet. And I'm saying we've got a minor on our premises whose legal guardian is missing, which creates problems I don't think we've fully thought through." "I've thought through it," Grim said. "Have you?" Briggs looked at him steadily. "Because the last time you made a call like this without thinking it all the way through—" The room went very still. Grim looked at Briggs with an expression that was completely flat. Not angry. Anger would have been easier. It was the absence of expression, which in a face like his carried more weight. "That's enough," he said again. 2 words. The same 2 words. But the second time they were a wall. Briggs held the look for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his coffee, stood up, and walked to the far end of the room where he stood with his back to the table, staring at nothing. Eli looked at Grim. Grim didn't look back. He'd already returned his attention to the laptop screen, but the set of his jaw had changed in some subtle way that Eli filed away without knowing what to do with it. "The last time you made a call like this without thinking it all the way through." "What call? What last time?" He didn't ask. He could feel that the question had a shape that would cost something to touch. But it sat in the room alongside everything else now. One more thing, with no answer, yet. Nova handled the school situation by calling the main office from a number they couldn't trace and identifying herself as Eli's maternal aunt, who was now in residence at the family home following a family medical matter. She gave them Vivian's address, confirmed Eli's enrollment, and told them he'd be back within the week pending the family situation's resolution. She did all of this in a single phone call, from memory, without notes, in the smooth and utterly convincing tone of someone who had told convincing necessary lies before and had made peace with the category. Eli watched her hang up. "Do you do that a lot?" "Sometimes things need to happen faster than paperwork allows," she said. "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He thought about pressing it. He thought about the specific quality of Nova's competence, the way she moved through surveillance records and shell companies and county permits like someone who'd learned these systems from the inside, the scars on her forearm, the way she and Grim communicated in looks rather than words, a whole language developed over time and trouble. He let it go. For now. Instead, he said, "What did Briggs mean about the last time Grim made a call like this?" Nova's hands went still on the keyboard for a fraction of a second. "Where'd you hear that?" "He said it this morning, when they were—" Eli paused. "When they were arguing about me." Nova was quiet for a moment. She picked up her coffee, set it back down. That's Grimm's to tell or not tell, she said finally. Does it matter to what we're doing now? Most things that happened before matter to what's happening now. She looked at him. That's kind of the whole problem with the past. The surveillance run happened that afternoon. Trace drove, an unmarked gray panel van that smelled like hardware store, an old fast food, functional and forgettable. Nova rode in the back with a laptop balanced on a folding table and a directional scanner that Eli didn't ask the provenance of. Eli sat in the passenger seat beside Trace because Grimm had decided, after approximately 30 seconds of visible deliberation, that leaving him at the clubhouse without either Grimm or Nova present was not something he was willing to do. Briggs had noted this decision with a look and said nothing. They parked on a service road that ran along the tree line behind the ridge, 300 meters from the rear of the Blackwater Ridge property. Through the bare November trees, the main building was visible as a blocky shape of illuminated windows, fluorescent white bleeding into gray afternoon light. Farther back, separated from the main building by a concrete path and what appeared to be a service yard, was the annex. Dark. No visible windows on this elevation. A single door in the center of the rear wall, heavy gauge, the kind with a card reader mounted beside it rather than a conventional lock. That's not HVAC, Trace said, looking through a lens. No, Nova said. Card reader access for a storage building. Climate-controlled pharmaceutical storage could justify it, Nova said. Technically. You believe that? No. Eli watched the annex, watched the path between the main building and the annex, watched the service yard where a white cargo van sat parked with its engine off, but its parking lights on, which was a small strange detail he couldn't explain. Who parks with their parking lights on for... He checked the van's dashboard clock. 40 minutes. Trace looked where Eli was looking, looked at Nova. Nova had already turned the directional scanner toward the van. Getting a partial plate, she said quietly. Running it. They waited. The van sat with its amber lights pulsing against the gray afternoon. After 4 minutes, the rear door of the main building opened and two figures emerged, both in dark clothing, both carrying what appeared to be cardboard archive boxes. They loaded the boxes into the back of the van, went back inside, came out with two more. They're moving records, Trace said. His voice had dropped. Or moving something in record boxes, Nova said. Who moves records at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday? Someone who heard something they didn't like, Nova said. Someone who's cleaning up. Eli's hands were flat against his thighs. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips. Does this mean they know someone's looking? The question sat in the van for a long moment. Plate comes back registered to a holding company, Nova said. Cantera Property Management, LLC. Incorporated in Delaware, registered agent is a law office in Nashville. She paused. Cantera Property Management, LLC is listed as a property lessor for 3 facilities in this region. Another pause, longer. One of those facilities is Blackwater Ridge Manor. Trace exhaled slowly through his teeth. Same company owns the building and operates the care facility, Eli said. Same company owns the building, leases it to the operating entity, and is now apparently sending a van to pick up boxes on a Tuesday afternoon. Nova's voice was controlled, but barely. Which means whatever's in those boxes, the property company wants it, not the facility, the parent entity. What does that mean? It means this goes higher than the facility director, Grimm said from the back of the van. Eli hadn't heard him move. He turned. Grimm was crouched near the rear doors, looking through a narrow gap, his face carrying that same calculating absence of expression. He'd apparently been listening the whole time. How high? Trace asked. High enough to have corporate lawyers on retainer in Nashville and shell companies incorporated in Delaware, Grimm said. High enough to move assets when they feel threatened. And they feel threatened now, Nova said. They feel something, whether it's us or just general exposure, I don't know. Grimm looked at Eli. If they're moving records, they may also be moving people. Eli understood what that meant. We need to find out what's in the annex. We need to find out who else is involved before we go anywhere near that annex, Grimm said. You don't walk into something like this without knowing what's on the other side. We don't have time to see. Eli. Grim's voice wasn't hard. It was something almost harder than hard. It was patient. Running fast at the wrong door gets people killed. Your mother survived this long. That means whatever they're doing in there, she's still useful to them. Which means we have a window, but it's not a window that stays open if we make noise in the wrong place. Eli looked at him. Looked at the van still sitting in the service yard with its parking lights on. Looked at the annex dark, windowless face. How do you know she's useful to them? He said. How do you know she's not? I don't know, Grim said. The honesty of it was clean and sharp. I'm working on probability, and probability says yes, but I'm not going to lie to you about what I know and what I don't. Eli turned back to face the windshield. Breathed. The van in the service yard finally moved, reversed out of its spot, turned, disappeared around the far side of the main building. They were gone. Whatever had been in those boxes was gone with them. The argument that night was worse than the one that morning. It was Briggs again, but this time it wasn't just Briggs. A man named Carver, older, VP patch on his vest, the permanent squint of someone who'd spent years outdoors, sat beside him, and the two of them had the coordinated quality of people who'd been talking before they walked back into the main room. There's a detective, Carver said. He had a folded piece of paper on the table in front of him, placed precisely, like evidence. Name's Cross, Lena Cross. She worked the Mecklenburg trafficking case in 2019 before she transferred here. She's clean. How clean? Grim said. Clean enough that the DA's office in Charlotte still returns her calls. Carver unfolded the paper. She's been looking at Blackwater Ridge on her own time for 3 months, before any of this. Something flagged for her. One of the phantom transfer facilities matched an address she recognized from the Mecklenburg case. The room absorbed this. Eli looked at Nova. Nova's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. She's already on it, Grim said. It wasn't a question. She's been on it quietly. She doesn't have enough for a warrant yet. She needs corroborating documentation. Carver held Grim's eyes. If we hand her what Milo pulled together, the phantom facilities, the shell company, the annex building permits, she can move officially. Police resources, proper procedure. And a 60-day timeline while she builds the case, Briggs said. If we're lucky. If the DA doesn't bury it. If whoever's running Cantera doesn't have a line inside the department, which given what we've seen, is not a given. It's the right move, Carver said. It might be the right move, Briggs corrected, but it's not the fast move. We're not doing the fast move, Carver said. He looked at Grim. Not a challenge, a reminder. We talked about this, after what happened with Denny. The room went quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet before. This quiet had weight and history in it. Eli watched Grim, watched the way his hands were flat on the table, very still, the way a man's hands go still when what's moving is happening somewhere else. The name Denny had done something in the room's atmosphere that Eli couldn't fully interpret. A tightening, a drawing back, something with grief in it, and more than grief. Denny's not... Grim started. Denny's exactly the reason, Carver said quietly. And you know it. The silence stretched out long enough to become its own kind of answer. Grim looked at the table for a moment, then he looked up. Set up the meeting with Cross, he said. But we do it my way. We don't hand her everything at once. We hand her enough to open the door officially. We keep our own eyes on that annex. Grim, my way, he said. Final. Carver looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the far wall. Neither of them pushed further. Eli waited until the two of them had moved away before he crossed to where Grim stood, which took something. The man's gravity, when he was like this, was a thing you felt before you reached him. Who was Denny? Eli said. Grim looked at him for a long time, long enough that Eli thought he wouldn't answer. A kid, he said finally. Not much older than you. He paused. We moved fast on something we didn't have fully mapped, and it cost him. He stopped there. The sentence didn't need finishing. The weight of the unfinished ending was the point. Eli stood with that. He thought about being small and moving fast and the things that happened when the door you ran at was the wrong one. He thought about his mother and the way careful she'd always been, the way she'd taped every edge of that index card before hiding it where only he would find it. She'd prepared for something. She'd known the risk and prepared for it anyway. She found the transfer discrepancy, Eli said, half to himself. She found it and she asked about it. And then she disappeared. He looked at Grimm. Weiss found something too, and he disappeared, but you said they needed them quiet, not gone. So where are they keeping them? The annex, Grimm said. You don't know that. No. He said it simply. But it's where I'd put them. Then that's where we need to look. That's where we will look, Grimm said, when we know who's watching it from the inside. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Nova took it in the back hallway, which was visible from the main room through the open doorway. Eli watched the quality of her body language shift in the first 20 seconds of the call. The way her shoulders came forward, the way her free hand found the wall beside her and pressed flat against it. Whatever she was hearing was changing the shape of something. She came back into the main room. Her face was controlled. That was a source, she said. Someone who works at the county health department. She's been quietly pulling file requests on Blackwater Ridge for the past 6 weeks. She paused. She just got a call from her supervisor. Effective immediately, access to Blackwater Ridge's compliance records has been restricted to senior administrators only. Standard access revoked. On whose authority? Grimm asked. The request came from the state licensing board, countersigned by someone in the county executive's office. Nova's voice was flat and careful. Which means someone with reach into county government just locked the official records. They know someone's looking, Trace said. They know more than that, Nova said. My source said the restriction request included a list of names, people whose access was being flagged. She looked at Grimm. One of the names on that list was Detective Lena Cross. The room processed that. They have someone inside the department, Briggs said. He said it with the tone of someone who'd expected this information for some time and found no satisfaction in being right. Or inside county government, Milo said. Either way, Cross's investigation isn't quiet anymore. Whoever they have inside just told the parent company that a detective's been asking questions. Which means they're going to move, Grimm said. Not in weeks. Days. Hours, Nova said. Her voice came out even but cost something. My source said the restriction was flagged as urgent. Effective immediately, she said. They don't do emergency record restrictions on a Tuesday night unless they're already in motion. Eli stood up. He hadn't realized he'd been sitting. If they move the people in that annex tonight, they won't tonight, Grimm said. Too much visibility. They need vehicles. They need to establish cover. They need to coordinate receiving locations. He was thinking out loud, running logistics. They've got until first light. Maybe. Maybe, Eli repeated. We call Cross now, Nova said. We give her everything, all of it. We don't manage the timeline anymore. We hand it over. If Cross moves officially and her department is compromised, Briggs started. Then we're right behind her, Grimm said. He was already moving, picking up his jacket from the back of the chair, checking his phone, moving through the room with the focused momentum of a man who'd run out of deliberation time and knew it. Milo, call Cross. Give her the address and tell her what we think is in the annex. Give her the shell company documents. All of it. He was pulling on his jacket. Trace, Briggs, we're going to sit on that service road tonight. Nothing moves in or out of that property without us knowing. And if they move before Cross gets there? Carver asked. Grimm looked at him steadily. Then we improvise. That's what you said about Denny. A silence fell between them like something dropped. I know what I said about Denny. Grimm's voice was so quiet it barely carried across the room. And I know what it cost. He held Carver's eyes. But there's a 34-year-old woman in that building who asked the right question and got buried for it. And there's her kid standing in my clubhouse who hasn't stopped moving for 5 days. He paused. I'm not leaving her there. Nobody said anything else. Boots on wood, jackets, keys, the heavy choreography of men and women who knew how to move when the time for planning was over. Cold air cutting in through the door as it opened, the sound of motorcycles coming to life in the dark outside. That low specific rumble that was never just mechanical, that always carried something underneath it, something about men who had learned to keep moving because stopping was where the worst things caught you. Eli grabbed his jacket. You stay here, Grimm said, not turning around. You can't. I'm not negotiating this. He turned then, and his face in the amber light was the face of a man who'd already seen the version of this story where he made the wrong call and was not going to watch it happen again. You stay here with Milo. You help him organize the documents for Cross. That is the job I'm giving you, and it matters as much as what we're doing out there. He held Eli's eyes. Can you do that? Eli stood in the middle of the room and felt 11 years old in every cell of his body and hated it. He looked at the door, at Grim, at the darkness outside where the motorcycles were already idling, waiting. Yeah, he said, I can do that. Grim held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked out, and the door closed, and the sound of the engines rose and then faded down Depot Road into the silence after the motorcycles faded was the loudest thing Eli had ever heard. He stood in the middle of the clubhouse and listened to it settle around him like something physical. The absence of engines, the absence of boots on wood, the absence of the specific low-frequency hum that a room full of people with purpose generates without meaning to. Just the space heater ticking in the corner, the dog shifting in its sleep. Milo's keyboard, the wind finding the gaps in the window frames and pushing through them with the patient indifference of something that had all night. Eli sat down at the table. Milo slid a stack of printed documents toward him without looking up. Start with the shell company chain. Work backward from Cantera. Anything that connects to a name, a real name, not a registered agent, flag it with a paperclip. There are paperclips in the tray. Eli pulled the stack toward him, found the paperclips, started reading. He was good at reading. His mother had made sure of that. She'd been the kind of parent who treated a public library card like a household utility, who read beside him at the kitchen table on winter evenings while the old baseboard heater clicked and the neighborhood went quiet. He thought about that now. The specific image of her across a table from him, both of them reading, the lamplight between them, and the image was so ordinary and so unreachable that he had to put it somewhere else in his mind and close the door on it, or it would stop him from doing the thing he needed to do. He read, Cantera Property Management. LLC had been incorporated in Delaware in 2016. Its registered agent was a Nashville law firm called Merritt and Stahl. Its sole listed officer was a man named Gerald Ashby, whose name appeared on exactly 3 other business registrations in the state database, and whose residential address resolved to a mail forwarding service in Brentwood, Tennessee. Gerald Ashby was a ghost. Eli didn't need Milo to tell him that. But behind Gerald Ashby's name, buried in the operating agreement documents that Milo had pulled from a state business filing database, was a list of beneficial owners. The list was formatted as a series of numbered percentage interests. Most of the percentages resolved back to numbered LLCs with their own chains of registered agents. But one of them, 11%, the smallest interest on the list, was assigned directly to an individual. The name was Warren Holt. Eli clipped it. Milo, who is Warren Holt? Milo stopped typing. He looked at the page Eli was holding up, leaned forward, and read the name. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the feeling of a piece of something dropping into a slot it had been cut for. Where'd you find that? Operating agreement, page 4, beneficial ownership schedule. Milo was already at his keyboard. Eli watched him run the name through 2 different databases in under a minute, watched his face as the results came back. The quality of Milo's stillness changed, the kind of stillness that isn't calm. Warren Holt, Milo said slowly, sits on the board of the Harlan County Regional Healthcare Authority. He paused. He has since 2017. Another pause. The Healthcare Authority is the oversight body responsible for licensing and compliance review of all residential care facilities in this county. He looked at Eli across the table. Including Blackwater Ridge Manor. Eli stared at him. He's the oversight, Eli said. He's part of the oversight. He owns 11% of the property company that controls the facility he's supposed to be regulating. Milo's voice was completely level, and he's been in that position for 7 years. That's not corruption, Eli said. That's architecture. That's the whole thing built this way from the beginning. Yeah, Milo said quietly. It is. Eli thought about the 14 compliance complaints that had resolved with no findings. He thought about the building inspector who'd retired at 51 to a house in Gatlinburg. He thought about the record restriction that had come through the county executive's office tonight, bearing Warren Holt's employer's name on it in one form or another. He thought about Detective Lena Cross, whose name had appeared on a flagged access list that someone inside county government had compiled. "Milo Edson," he said. "Has anyone gotten through to Detective Cross yet?" Milo picked up his phone, looked at the screen. Grim was supposed to call her from the road. He pulled up a message thread, read something. His jaw tightened incrementally. "What?" He texted. "Cross's phone is going to voicemail." "Try her again." "He has, 4 times in the last hour." The space heater ticked. The dog raised its head from the floor, looked at nothing, lay back down. Eli looked at the clock on the wall above the bar counter. It was 20 minutes past 1 in the morning. Detective Lena Cross, whose investigation had been compromised, whose name was on a flagged list, whose phone was going to voicemail at 1 in the morning. "Something happened to her," Eli said. "We don't know." "Something happened to her." Milo looked at him. Then he looked at his phone. Then he set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone who was deciding how much weight a conclusion deserved before speaking it out loud. "I'm going to try one more number," he said. The call that came back wasn't from Cross. It was from a man named Pruitt, a name Milo wrote on the legal pad and underlined, a retired county sheriff's deputy who had apparently been Milo's source on local law enforcement for long enough that Milo trusted the information without qualifying it. Pruitt talked for 2 minutes. Milo wrote 4 things on the legal pad. When he hung up, he sat for a moment looking at what he'd written. Then he turned the pad toward Eli. The 4 things were: Cross, taken off active duty 11 p.m. Administrative suspension, cause undisclosed. Home address is outside county. No contact. And below that, underlined twice, Department Internal Affairs involvement. Source is someone in Holt's office. Eli read it twice. "They suspended her," he said. "Tonight. Hours after the record restriction went through. Holt moved on her the same night we found his name." "We didn't find his name until 20 minutes ago," Milo said. "He moved on her before we found anything." He tapped the pad, which means he wasn't reacting to us. He was already in motion. He looked at Eli. The record restriction, the access flagging, Cross's suspension, those weren't reactive. They were already planned. Something else triggered it. "What else?" Milo stared at the table. His hands were flat and still on either side of the legal pad. "Someone inside the facility," he said slowly. "Someone who knew Cross had been asking questions and had access to report it up the chain." He paused. "Someone currently inside Blackwater Ridge who is working for them." Eli felt the cold settle differently in his stomach. How close to the facility is Grim right now? Milo was already reaching for his phone. The call connected on the second ring. Grim's voice came through the speaker flat and close and with wind behind it. "Talk." "We've got a problem," Milo said. He relayed it fast and clean, Holt's name, the oversight board, the pre-planned suspension. The possibility of a source inside the facility who'd moved before anything they'd done tonight could have reached anyone. The silence on the other end lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which Eli could hear distantly the idle of Harleys and the cold and what might have been rain starting somewhere along Route 9. "How long ago was Cross suspended?" Grim said. "Pruitt says 11 p.m., 2 hours ago." "So someone inside that facility made a call to Holt or Holt's contact before we were ever on that service road." Grim's voice had gone to a particular register, the combat logistics register, Eli would later understand, the mode where everything got stripped down to variables and timelines and the fastest path between 2 points. Which means they know they're exposed, not by us specifically, but exposed. "They're going to move," Milo said. "They already are." A pause. "There's been activity at the annex in the last 40 minutes. 2 vehicles, a cargo van, different one from this afternoon, and a black SUV we can't get the plate on because it's backed up against the building. People moving in and out of the rear door." His voice dropped fractionally. We've counted what looks like 6 to 8 individuals being moved. They're using gurneys. Eli's hand clamped around the edge of the table. Gurneys, Milo said. Medical transport, not ambulances, unmarked. A pause. Whoever they're moving is not ambulatory, or they don't want them to be. Mom, Eli said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out the way things do when the body bypasses the decision-making layer entirely. Grim heard it. The line was quiet for a second. We're watching them. Nobody is moving off this property without us following. His voice addressed Eli directly, even though Milo was holding the phone. I hear you. We're not losing them. You need to stop that van, Eli said. You need to... Not yet. The flatness in Grim's voice was the hardest thing. Not until we know where it's going. If we stop it here, we get a van. We don't get who sent it. A pause. I need you to stay where you are, and I need you to trust me. The line closed. Eli stood in the middle of the room with the specific internal experience of a person who is being asked to be still while everything that matters to them is in motion. He looked at the clock, at the door, at Milo, who was already back at the keyboard running the cargo van's partial plate through whatever databases he had access to, his face illuminated pale blue by the screen. The dog walked across the room and sat down beside Eli's feet without being invited. It was the most unexpectedly specific comfort he'd received in 5 days, and it nearly broke him completely. He sat down, picked up the documents, kept reading. At 2:47 a.m., Trace called. He didn't call Milo's phone. He called the Clubhouse landline, a thing Eli hadn't known existed until it rang, a corded phone mounted on the wall beside the bar that had the quality of something kept for emergencies rather than convenience. Milo answered it, listened, said 3 words, and hung up. He turned around. Get your jacket, he said. They met at a gas station on the county line. Trace's van was already there when Milo pulled in, parked away from the pumps with its lights off. Grim stood outside it, and the quality of his stillness when Eli climbed out of Milo's car was the quality of a man holding something very tightly inside a very small space. Briggs leaned against the van's passenger side with his arms crossed, watching the road. He looked at Eli when he approached and said nothing. His expression had lost the antagonism of the morning. What replaced it was something Eli found harder to read. Something that looked like it had been wrong about something and hadn't finished processing that. Where's the van? Milo asked. Lost it, Grim said. The 2 words landed in the cold air like something dropped from height. Lost it, Milo repeated. Route 9 runs through Caldwell Hollow before it hits the county line. No lights, dense tree cover, 4 possible turnoffs in a half-mile stretch. Grim's jaw worked. They killed their lights at the hollow. By the time we got through, they were gone. No tire tracks we could follow in the dark. He paused. The SUV we tracked east toward Dunmore. Nova and Carver are on it, but it may be a decoy. So the people on those gurneys, Milo started, are somewhere in a 3-mile radius of Caldwell Hollow, Grim said. Or they made it out of the county, one or the other. Eli stood in the cold and felt the weight of that settling through him like ice water finding the lowest point. He thought about gurneys, about people who weren't ambulatory, about his mother's hands going still in some dark place while a van drove without its lights through a hollow in the dark. There's something else, Trace said. He was standing by the van's rear door, and his voice had the specific quality of someone who has been sitting with information long enough that sitting with it is no longer possible. He looked at Grim. Tell him. Grim looked at Trace, then at Eli, then at the ground for a moment. When we were watching the annex, he said, before they started moving people, there was a window, small, high up, on the north face of the building. We almost missed it because it wasn't in the building permits. He paused. There was light behind it, faint, and a shape. Eli waited. Someone was at that window, Grim said, for about 30 seconds, before whoever was inside pulled them back. He looked at Eli steadily. The shape was small, and it was moving like someone who didn't want to be seen from inside the building, like someone trying to signal out. The gas station's fluorescent canopy hummed and flickered above them in the cold. Somewhere on the county road, a truck passed with its high beams on, swept them all in white light, and was gone. She knew you were out there, Eli said. Grim didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't have to. She's alive, Eli said. The hardness in his voice surprised him. It was the voice of someone who had moved past, hoping into something that didn't need hope because it had decided. She was alive 45 minutes ago, Grim said carefully. She's alive, Eli said again. From church. They drove back to the clubhouse in 2 vehicles, and nobody talked, and the talking that didn't happen had more weight in it than most conversations Eli had ever heard. He sat in the back of Milo's car and watched the dark county roads slide past, and held the image Grim had described, a small shape at a high window, trying to signal without being seen, and turned it over and over in his mind like something he needed to memorize before it was taken from him. She'd known they were out there. She'd found the window, and she'd stood at it, and she'd tried to reach across the distance between them in the only way she had available. That meant she was thinking clearly. That meant she was functional. That meant whoever was holding her, however they were holding her, hadn't broken what made her her. He held on to that. The woman arrived at the clubhouse at 4:15 a.m. She drove a rusted Civic with one headlight, parked it badly at the far end of the gravel lot, and sat in it for 3 minutes before getting out. Eli watched her from the window. She was maybe 40, with the kind of thinness that comes from chronic stress rather than intention, wearing a heavy coat 2 sizes too big, and carrying nothing. She looked at the clubhouse door the way people look at things they've decided to do before fear catches up with the decision. Grim met her at the door. She spoke to him quietly, and he brought her inside. Her name was Sherry Boone. She'd worked at Blackwater Ridge as a dietary aide for 6 years before she quit 11 weeks ago. She sat at the table in the amber light of the clubhouse with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking, and she had the particular quality of someone who has been carrying something for so long that the carrying has become its own kind of exhaustion. I've been trying to decide who to call for 2 months, she said. I called the police once. I hung up before it connected. She looked at her hands. I have a daughter. Nobody's going to know you were here, Nova said. She was across the table, her voice even and her posture deliberate, open, non-threatening, the posture of someone creating a space rather than occupying one. You can't promise that. No, Nova said. I can't. But I can tell you that the people in this room have more reason than you do to keep you safe, because you have information we need, and because that's what we do. She paused. Whatever you tell us stays in this room until we've figured out how to use it without getting you hurt. Sherry Boone looked around the room, at Grim, at Trace, at Briggs, who was standing in the doorway to the hallway with his arms at his sides, not crossed. An unconscious adjustment, Eli thought, the posture of someone who'd learned to make himself less intimidating when the situation required it. At Eli, whose presence in this room of scarred adults seemed to do something to her, soften something, or confirm something. She drank some of the coffee. Then she told them. The annex was not storage. It never had been. In the early months, before she understood what she was seeing, she'd thought it was some kind of intensive care unit, off-book, serving patients whose families had chosen private arrangements outside the standard facility structure. There were patients in there who weren't in the main building's census. She'd stumbled onto the access corridor during a supply run, through a maintenance door she hadn't known connected to anything. She'd seen 2 rooms. She'd seen beds with rails. She'd seen IV lines. She'd seen a man she'd never seen before doing something at a computer that wasn't a medical chart system. She'd backed out before anyone saw her. She quit 3 weeks later. She told her supervisor she had a family situation. She told her husband she'd found a better job. She told her daughter nothing. She drove a different route to the grocery store for 2 months because the route she'd always used went past the facility. How many people were in those rooms? Grim asked. I saw 4, but there were more doors. She looked at him. I heard sounds from behind them, not screaming, just sounds. People existing in a space that isn't a regular medical space. She paused. One of the rooms had a woman in it who had a bruise on her arm, fresh, like from a restraint. She put the mug down. She looked at me when I came in. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you've been waiting a long time for someone to open a door. The room was very still. Eli's hands were flat on his thighs under the table. He thought about his mother's hands, about bruises from restraints, about the shape at the high window. The patient's being transferred on paper, Nova said carefully. The phantom facilities. You think the patients were being moved to the annex? I don't think, Sherry said. I know, because one of the residents I brought meals to, a woman named Alice Tremblay, 82, very sharp, always tipped me when her family visited. She disappeared off the floor. Transfer order said she'd gone to a care facility in Knoxville. She looked at her hands again. I saw her through one of those annex room doors, same week as the transfer order. Why would they do that? Trace said. What's the point? What do they get from the billing? Milo said from the back of the room. His voice was careful and terrible. Once a patient is transferred on paper, their insurance, their Medicare, their private policies, their long-term care coverage continues to pay. It pays the receiving facility. But if the receiving facility doesn't exist, the payments route back through the LLC structure to Cantera. He paused. And the patients keep receiving care, which means the costs continue, which means Blackwater Ridge Manor continues billing the Phantom facility for the care it's providing. He paused again. You can double bill a patient who exists in two places at once on paper. For how long? Nova asked. As long as the patient is alive. He let that settle. And as long as the patient's family and the patient's doctors all believe they're in a legitimate facility 200 miles away, nobody comes looking. He paused. Until an employee notices the wrong thing, or a medication technician runs the wrong transfer log, or a night shift CNA sees a name on a form that matches a person she medicated that same morning. The room had gone to the specific stillness of people absorbing the full shape of a thing they'd suspected, but not completed. Sherry Boone stared at the table. Alice Tremblay's family thinks she's in Knoxville, she said quietly. Probably, Milo said. Probably most of those families think their people are somewhere they're not. How many? Grimm asked. Over 4 years, at the billing rates for this facility's patient census. Milo ran numbers in his head the way people do when the numbers are simple enough to be devastating. Conservatively, dozens. If this has been running since the annex was built in 2019, he paused. And if the receiving facilities are phantom, there's no transfer documentation anywhere that would survive a proper audit. Every trace is designed to disappear. Eli thought about a woman named Alice Tremblay who'd tipped the dietary aide when her family visited. He thought about her family visiting a facility in Knoxville and being told, what? That she couldn't receive visitors today? That her condition had changed? That she'd been moved to a different wing? He thought about families who would eventually stop visiting, who would be billed and billed and billed for a loved one they stopped being able to reach, who would assume the distance was medical, was complicated, was beyond their ability to understand. He thought about what an organized system of that kind needed, above all else, to keep functioning. Silence, compliance, and the swift removal of anyone who threatened either. Weiss and my mother, Eli said. Yes, Milo said, simply. There were others, before them. Milo looked at him. Probably. So this has been running for years, and people have been buried for years, and every time someone found it, they made it go away, Grimm said. His voice had a quality in it that Eli would later, years later, try to describe and always fail to fully, something that was anger translated over a long time into something past anger, something cold and absolute that didn't need heat anymore because it had moved past the stage where heat was useful. Sherry Boone looked up from her hands. There's one more thing, she said. The room waited. The man I saw at the computer in the annex, she said. I didn't know him, but I saw him twice more after that. Once in the facility's main hallway, and once in the parking lot talking to the administrator. She paused. The second time I saw him, he was in a different car. Nice car. Not the kind of car facility staff drive. She paused again. I looked at the plates out of habit. Habit from, I don't know. Habit. She looked at Grimm. The plates were county government issue. Nova's hands went very still on the table. You're sure, Grimm said. I'm sure. I've seen those plates my whole life. My father worked county maintenance. She looked at the mug. The man with the county plates was in the annex of a facility billing ghost patients. He was comfortable there. He knew where things were. He wasn't inspecting. He was operating. Warren Holt, Milo said. Not a question. I don't know his name, Sherry said, but if you showed me a picture, I could tell you. Milo was already pulling something up on the laptop. He turned the screen toward her. A county board profile photograph. Bureaucratic, standard issue, a man in his mid-50s with the comfortable face of long institutional tenure. Sherry Boone looked at it for 2 seconds. That's him, she said. The silence in the room was the kind that happens when the last piece of something slots into place and the shape of the whole becomes visible for the first time, and what it looks like is much larger and much older than anyone wanted it to be. Grimm stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, looking at nothing, and the set of his shoulders was the set of a man doing something very hard internally that he wasn't going to do in front of anyone. Eli looked at him. He thought about what Carver had said, after what happened with Denny. He thought about what Grimm had said in return. I know what it cost. He thought about a man who'd been living with a mistake for long enough that caution had become a kind of wound in him. A man who'd tried to do the right thing fast once and lost someone because of it. A man who'd spent however many years since then doing everything slower, more carefully, managing every timeline, never running at the wrong door again. He thought about what this moment cost Grimm specifically. Not just the danger, but the demand to be fast when fast was the thing that had broken him. Grimm, Eli said. Grimm didn't turn around. I know you're scared to move fast, Eli said. I know why. The room was so quiet that the space heater's ticking was the loudest sound in it. I'm not asking you to do what you did before. I'm asking you to do what's different this time. Eli's voice was steady in the way that things go steady when they've been shaking for long enough. This time, we know where they are. We know who they answer to. We know what they're hiding. He paused. Last time you didn't have enough. This time, we have too much to wait. Grimm stood at the window for a long moment. Then he turned around. His face was the face of a man who had just picked up something he'd put down a long time ago and decided to carry it again, with full knowledge of what it weighed. Milo, he said, get me everything we have in one file. Everything. Shell company chain, Holt's connection, the annex permits, Sherry's testimony, the surveillance logs, the transfer records. He paused. And call Pruitt again. Tell him I need anyone he trusts in this county with a badge. Anyone at all. He looked at Nova. We're not waiting for Cross. We're building this without her. Grimm, Briggs started. I know, Grimm said. He looked at Briggs with an expression that was not an apology, but was the closest thing to one that his particular architecture allowed. I know. A pause. But he's right. We have enough. And the van with those people in it is parked somewhere in a 3-mile radius right now, and the longer we sit here, the farther away it gets from that. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Then he unfolded his arms. Tell me what you need, he said. Nova was already at the keyboard. Milo was on the phone. Trace was pulling on his jacket. The dog got up from the floor and moved to the door and sat there as if it had been told something nobody else had heard yet. Eli sat at the table with the documents still spread in front of him and felt the room change around him. Felt the specific atmospheric shift of people who have been calculating risk finally deciding the calculation is done. The moment when the gear catches and the machine that has been idling in place begins to... The machine had been idling long enough. Now it moved. Milo had the consolidated file built in 22 minutes. Shell company chain, beneficial ownership schedule with Holt's name circled, annex building permits, phantom facility registrations, surveillance logs with timestamps, Sherry Boone's account typed verbatim and signed with her initials at the bottom of each page. He printed 2 copies and put one in a waterproof document sleeve without being asked. The other he photographed page by page with his phone and uploaded to a cloud account whose password only he and Grimm knew. Pruitt called back at 5:10 a.m. He had a name, a deputy named Reyes, no relation to Nova, who had transferred into Harlan County from a federal task force position 2 years ago, and whose personnel file apparently contained commendations that nobody in the current department had bothered to read because commendations from federal task forces made local administrators nervous. Pruitt said Reyes was clean the way Bedrock was clean. Not because nothing had ever tried to dirty it, but because the material didn't allow for it. Grim took the number, made the call himself, standing outside in the cold with his breath making clouds in the dark, his voice coming through the window as a low rumble that Eli couldn't parse into words. He came back inside with his jaw set in a new way. Reyes makes contact with the state police at 6 a.m., he said. Not county, state. Holt's jurisdiction ends at the county line. He looked at the room. We give her everything. She takes it up the chain herself and we stay out of the official picture. He paused. And we're at Caldwell Hollow in 40 minutes. All of us? Trace asked. Everyone who rides. Briggs looked at him from across the room. Something had shifted between them in the last hour. Not resolved, not apologized, but recalibrated in the way that long relationships recalibrate under pressure. The scar tissue of trust doing what scar tissue does when you need it to hold. Briggs gave a single nod. Then let's go, he said. Tab. Eli was not supposed to go. He understood this. He understood it the way he understood most of the things in his life that were decided for him by adults who believed they were protecting him, understood it completely and disagreed with it completely, and had already made his decision before the conversation happened. Nova found him putting on his jacket. She looked at him for a moment. She had the expression of someone running a calculation they already know the answer to and are running anyway out of professional obligation. You know what Grimm said. I know. You know why he said it. Because of Denny. Eli met her eyes. But Denny wasn't looking for his mother. Nova was quiet. I'm not going to get in the way, he said. I'm not going to do anything. I need to be there. I need to be somewhere that isn't here waiting for a phone to ring. His voice stayed flat. He was proud of how flat it stayed. Please. Nova looked at him for a very long moment. Then she looked at the door. Then she picked up her own jacket. You stay in the van, she said. You do not get out of the van for any reason unless I come to the van specifically and tell you to. You don't open the door. You don't roll down the window. You don't make a sound. She paused. And you don't tell Grimm I agreed to this until we're already moving. Eli pulled on his jacket. Okay. I mean it. One deviation. I know, he said. I know. She held his eyes for another second. Then she turned and walked to the door, and Eli followed her out into the coldest part of the night, that thin hour before 5 a.m. when the temperature stops dropping only because it has found its floor. Caldwell Hollow was 3 miles of county road swallowed by the ridgeline on both sides, the tree cover so dense that in summer you could drive through it at noon and still need your headlights. In late November it was just canopy skeleton and cold and the specific silence of a place too far from anything to carry other people's noise. They drove dark, Trace's van first, no headlights once they turned off Route 9, navigating by the ambient glow of the pre-dawn sky through bare branches. Grimm and Briggs on motorcycles behind, engines dropped to a low murmur, the kind of throttle control that takes years to develop and sounds like something trying not to wake a house. Milo had been right about the 3-mile radius. Nova found the cargo van with the scanner, not the plate, not the vehicle, but the radio frequency it was using, a private band that Milo had identified from the partial signal they'd caught at the service road. She triangulated the signal in 8 minutes and pointed Trace down a turnoff so narrow it wasn't on the county road map, just a dirt path through second-growth timber that ended at what had been, at some point, a livestock barn. The barn sat in a clearing with its doors closed and 2 vehicles parked outside. The cargo van and a dark sedan with county plates. Holt's car. Grimm pulled his motorcycle up beside the van and cut the engine. He sat in the sudden silence and looked at the barn for a long moment, and Eli, watching from the van's passenger window, watched him do it. Watched the man run every calculation available to him in the time available to run it and come out the other side of all of them still sitting in front of a barn where his calculation said people were being held. He got off the bike. Briggs was already moving around the far side of the clearing, circling wide through the tree line, his footsteps inaudible in the dead leaves. Trace cut the van's engine. The silence that fell was enormous and complete. Nova put her hand on Eli's shoulder. Not a restraint, a reminder. He stayed in the van. What happened in the next 6 minutes, Eli could only partially reconstruct from the sounds and the angles visible through the van's windshield and the pieces that came later in other people's telling of it. Grim approached the barn's side door, not the main doors, the smaller one set into the east face. He tried the handle. Locked, card reader, the same system as the annex. He stood there for approximately 3 seconds and then stepped back and put his boot through the door frame beside the card reader at exactly the point where the latch bolt met the strike plate, and the door opened the way doors open when someone who knows what they're doing decides it should, with a crack of splitting wood and a finality that had no alarm because whoever had set this up had not expected to be found here. Inside the barn, generator hum, electric light, industrial, strung from the rafters. The smell that hit Grim first, which he would describe later as chemical and close, the specific smell of a medical space operating without ventilation in an enclosed structure, was the smell that made him move faster. 4 stalls along the left wall had been converted to holding rooms, crude but functional, plywood partitions, cot frames, IV lines running from portable stands. 3 of the 4 were occupied. Grim found the first 2 within 90 seconds. An elderly woman, sedated, breathing shallowly but breathing. An elderly man, more alert, who tried to speak and couldn't, either from sedation or from something else, and who grabbed Grim's forearm with both hands when Grim checked his pulse and held on with the grip of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a hand to grab. Grim held on back. Trace appeared behind him and took over with the man, talking to him quietly, keeping his hands visible, his voice doing the thing it did when he was managing something fragile, low and steady, and without the edges that Trace's voice normally had. The third stall. Eli didn't see Grim open the door. He saw Grim's silhouette in the barn's lit doorway for a moment, and he saw the silhouette stop, and he saw something happen in the set of the man's shoulders that he didn't have language for yet. He reached for the van door. Nova's hand tightened on his shoulder. "Wait," she said. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were on the barn. "He stopped," Eli said. "He stopped." Wait. The longest 40 seconds of Eli Mercer's life. Then Grim appeared in the barn doorway. He looked across the clearing directly at the van, and the look on his face, the specific quality of what was in it, the thing that made Eli's breath stop completely, was not grief. It was not pity. It was the expression of a man who has just found what he was looking for and who knows that the boy in the van needs to know that immediately, before anything else, above everything else. He gave a single nod. Nova took her hand off Eli's shoulder. He was out of the van before she finished saying his name. He didn't run. His legs didn't work right for running. He crossed the clearing in something between a walk and a run, not feeling the cold, not feeling the gravel under his sneakers, not feeling anything except the specific compressed urgency of a body that has been waiting for 5 days and 6 nights to be allowed to move toward the thing it needed. He went through the barn door. The smell hit him, chemicals and cold, and something underneath both of them that was just the specific smell of a place that people had been in against their will. The generator hummed. The light was harsh and flat. Grim stepped aside from the third stall doorway, and Eli went through it, and there was his mother. She was on the cot with her back against the plywood partition, sitting up because she had apparently heard the door break open and pulled herself upright, and her face was pale and her hair was wrong, too flat on one side, matted, the way hair gets when someone has been horizontal too long. And there was a bruise on her left forearm that Eli refused to look at directly. There was an IV line, disconnected now, the port still taped to the inside of her elbow. Her eyes were too bright, the hyper-focused brightness of someone whose body has been fighting sedation. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at him when she left for night shifts. Once at the door, once over her shoulder, like she was counting something. "Eli," she said. Her voice came out wrong, thick and stripped down, like it had been a long time since she'd used it for anything but the most necessary things. She said his name like it was the most necessary thing. He crossed the 3 feet between the doorway and the cot and sat down next to her, and she put both arms around him. And the specific quality of that, the feel of her arms, the particular way she held him, the way she always held him with one hand on the back of his head like she was measuring whether he was still there, broke everything in him that had been held in check for 5 days and 6 nights, and he did not make a sound. He just held on. Grim stood outside the stall doorway and said nothing, and looked at the barn wall and gave them the only thing he had available to give in that moment, which was the simple decency of not watching. The sound of the sedan's engine was what broke it. It was trying to leave. Holt's car backed up against the fence line at the far edge of the clearing. Someone in the driver's seat who had heard the barn door go and spent 6 minutes deciding whether to stay or go, and had gone with go. Too late. 3 minutes too late. But going now, tires spinning on the frost-hard ground, headlights cutting on and swinging across the clearing. Briggs stepped out of the tree line directly in front of it. He stood in the headlight beams with his arms at his sides and his feet planted shoulder-width apart, and he didn't move. Not defensive posture, not aggressive posture. Just a man in the road who had decided the car was not going past him. The specific quality of his stillness in those headlights was the quality of someone who had stopped calculating risk and was operating on something older and simpler than calculation. The car stopped. Grim came out of the barn at a walk, not a run, which was its own kind of statement. A man who understood that hurry implied uncertainty, and he was not uncertain. He crossed to the driver's door and stood beside it. The window was up. He waited. The window came down. Warren Holt was 57 years old and had the face of someone who had spent decades in the specific comfort of institutions that protected him. And right now that face was doing the thing faces do when the protection runs out, cycling through expressions too fast to settle on any of them. He looked at Grim. He looked at Briggs in the headlights. He looked back at Grim. "You're making a serious mistake," he said. Grim looked at him for a moment. "Get out of the car." "I'm a county official. You put your hands on me and—" "I said, get out of the car." The tone of it, not raised, not threatening in any performed way. Just the voice of someone whose patience for a particular kind of person had been exhausted at a cellular level. Holt got out of the car. He was taller than he looked in his board profile photo, and he was trying to use that height the way men like him used it. As a kind of institutional authority, the posture of someone accustomed to rooms where his height was part of his furniture. He looked at Grim with the specific expression of a man trying to locate the leverage he'd always been able to locate and finding the terrain unfamiliar. "You have no idea what you're involved in," Holt said. "I've got a pretty good idea," Grim said. 4 years of ghost billing, a secondary structure you built with a bribed inspector, patients transferred on paper to facilities that don't exist, employees who found out buried in a converted barn in Caldwell Hollow. He paused. And a county oversight position you used to make sure none of it ever got a second look. Holt's jaw tightened. "You can't prove—" "I've got a document file with your name on the beneficial ownership schedule, a signed testimony from a former employee who saw you operating in the annex, a surveillance log from tonight, and your car sitting in front of a barn that currently contains 3 people your facility reported as transferred to a facility in Knoxville." Grim looked at him steadily. "Which part do you want to start with?" Holt looked at the barn, at Grim. Something moved through his face, the shift that happens when leverage runs out and what's underneath it is exposed for the first time. "The people I work with," he said. His voice had changed, gone quieter, more careful. "You don't understand what they're capable of. Tell me. This facility is one piece. You're looking at one piece." He was talking faster now, the way people do when they've decided that information is their last available currency and they're spending it. "The billing network runs through 7 other facilities, 4 states. The people who built this don't leave loose ends." He looked at Grim with something that was almost genuine. "You've already made yourself a loose end. Your whole club, the boy." He paused. "They will come for all of you." The clearing was very quiet, frost in the dead grass. The sedan's engine still running, its headlights still cutting across Briggs' motionless silhouette. The generator hum from the barn. 7 facilities, Grim said. 4 states. Give me the names." "I give you names, and I'm a dead man." "You don't give me names, and you're a man who goes to prison while the people above you watch from a distance and do nothing." Grim held his eyes. "Which version of what happens next do you want to choose?" Holt stood in the cold with the headlights behind him and his county plates visible in Grimm's peripheral vision, and his face doing the arithmetic of someone who has run out of institutional shelter and is standing in a clearing at 5 in the morning, realizing that all the protection he's been paying for has been protection of the network, never protection of him. "I need," he started. The shot came from the tree line. Not at Holt, not at Grimm. The crack of it went over both of them and hit the sedan's windshield, and Holt dropped to the ground on pure reflex, and Grimm moved, not away, sideways, putting the car's body between himself and the tree line in one motion that had no wasted geometry in it. "Down!" Briggs' voice from the far side of the clearing, immediately followed by the sound of him moving through gravel. Trace's voice from inside the barn. "Nova! Nova!" Grimm was at the rear of the sedan, crouched low, looking toward the tree line where the shot had come from. The direction was northeast, dense second growth. No muzzle flash visible, which meant distance or suppressor or both. "How many?" he called toward the tree line. Not a question to anyone in the clearing. No answer. The answer was the second shot, which hit the dirt 2 feet from Holt's prone body and sent the man scrambling behind the tire he'd been next to with the graceless urgency of someone whose body has made a decision faster than their dignity can manage. Grimm looked back at the barn. Eli, Vivian, the 2 elderly patients and Trace inside with them. Nova somewhere in the tree line on the west face, which was the wrong side. He looked at Briggs, who had made it to the tree line on the north face and was visible as a silhouette in the pre-dawn gray. Briggs held up 2 fingers. Southeast direction, 2 points, 2 shooters, minimum. Grimm ran the scenario the way he'd been trained to run scenarios in places with worse geography than a clearing in Caldwell Hollow. Fast, flat, prioritizing. The barn had 1 door on the east face and the main doors on the south. The shooters were southeast. If they moved from the tree line toward the barn, the east door was exposed. He looked at Holt, face down in the frozen dirt, hands over his head, whatever composed authority he'd arrived with now completely translated into the universal physical grammar of someone who doesn't want to be shot. "Get up," Grimm said. "There. Get up and move to the barn. Now. Go." Holt crawled, then half ran, hunched across the clearing. Grimm moved behind him, staying low, using the sedan as cover for as long as it covered anything. The distance to the barn door was 40 feet of open ground. 40 feet of the specific kind of distance that people who've been shot at before understand as a number with weight in it, a number that means something in the body even before the mind finishes calculating it. He went. Holt reached the barn door first, and Grimm came through behind him and pulled the broken door shut against its damaged frame, and the sound of the third shot hitting the exterior wall of the barn went through both of them like a physical shock. Not the bullet, just the sound, the flat percussive crack of something designed to end things making contact with something designed to contain them. Inside the barn. The generator. The light. Trace crouched at the main door with it open 3 inches, looking out. The 2 elderly patients on their cots. Vivian Mercer sitting upright with her arms around Eli, and her eyes above his shoulder were open and focused, and taking in the barn and the door and the sound and doing the specific assessment of someone who has been waiting in a room for 5 days and is now in a different kind of danger, but is, at least, in a danger she can see. She looked at Grimm. "How many?" she said. It was the same question he'd asked. Same words, same register. Stripped down, operational, focused. He looked at her for a fraction of a second with the specific expression of a man reassessing a situation. 2 confirmed southeast, he said. Possibly more. Briggs is north, Nova west. We're inside, they're outside. He looked at the main door, at Trace. They're not coming in shooting. If they wanted casualties, they'd have led with something heavier. He paused. They want Holt. Eli looked at Holt, who was pressed against the east wall with his arms at his sides, and the look he gave the man was the look of someone who had assembled a complete picture of what another person had done and was standing in the middle of the consequences of it in a barn at 5 in the morning. Holt looked back at him. Something in Holt's face when he saw Eli, 11 years old, sitting next to a woman with a bruise on her forearm and an IV port still taped to her arm. Something cracked in whatever composure Holt had been running on. Not remorse exactly. something more primitive than remorse. The specific discomfort of a person who has spent years making decisions in offices and spreadsheets and legal filings and is now in the same room as the physical results of those decisions. Who knows you're here? Grim said to Holt. Right now. Who knows you drove to this location tonight? Holt pressed his lips together. The people shooting at your car know you're here, Grim said. The question is who told them? He paused. Which means whoever sent those shooters knew you'd run here, knew this location, which means either you're followed or you're burned. He let that land. Either way, being silent with me right now is exactly what they want you to do. Holt looked at the wall, at Eli, at Vivian, at his own hands. Nashville, he said. His voice had gone to something thin and controlled. There's a man in Nashville. He runs the billing network. I've met him twice. I know a face, a car, a general area. He paused. I don't have documentation. Everything we communicated went through cutouts. What's his name? He goes by Strand. I don't know if that's his real name. What does Strand know about tonight? Holt closed his eyes briefly. Everything. He has monitoring on the facility, probably on my car. He opened his eyes. He sent those shooters because I'm a liability now. Because I'm in a clearing in Caldwell Hollow at 5 a.m. with a document file God knows where and a... He looked at Grim. And whatever you are. He knows about the file, Nova's voice said. She was in the barn. She'd come through the main door while Holt was talking, slipping in with the specific quiet movement of someone who'd learned that entrances should be unremarkable. She was breathing hard. A cut along her right cheekbone, shallow, from something in the tree line, a branch or a graze, bleeding in a thin line down toward her jaw. She didn't touch it. She looked at Grim. The shooters are pulling back, both of them. I've got eyes on one retreating northwest. She wiped her hand across her cheek without looking at it. They're not trying to take the barn. They were covering Holt, keeping him from leaving with us. Or keeping him from talking, Trace said. He already talked, Nova said. She looked at Holt. You know that, right? Whatever window you had is already closed. She looked at Grim. We need to move. All of them. Before Strand repositions. Grim looked at the barn. At the patients, at Vivian and Eli, at Holt against the wall, at the door. He pulled out his phone and looked at the screen. Pruitt had sent a text. 4 words. Reyes is moving. Now. He showed it to Nova. She exhaled. State police are going to the facility. But Strand is still... I know. He looked at the barn door, at the lightning in the sky through the cracks in the east wall, the first gray edge of a dawn that was coming whether they were ready for it or not. He made the call the way he'd made every call in the last 4 hours, the way he'd learned to make them after Denny, after the years of carrying the weight of a mistake made too fast. Not by moving slow, but by moving with everything he had available, and this time he had enough. We move in 2 minutes, he said. Vivian goes in the van with Eli. The 2 patients go in my truck. Trace, you drive. Holt goes with Briggs. He looked at Holt steadily. Briggs is not gentle with people who've put elderly patients on IV lines in a livestock barn. I'd suggest you spend the drive cooperating. Holt looked at him. Where are you taking me? Away from Strand's people, Grim said, which right now is the only answer to that question that matters. He turned to Eli. The boy was on his feet now, standing beside his mother, one hand still in hers. Not a child holding a parent gesture, something more mutual than that. 2 people who had spent 5 days on opposite sides of an impossible distance and were not ready to put space between them again. Grim looked at him, looked at Vivian, looked back at Eli. You ready? He said. Eli looked at his mother. She looked at him. Something passed between them in that look that had been building for 5 days. Something made of granola bars and dead phones and voicemails and a laminated index card with packing tape on every edge. Something made of a small shape at a high window in the dark, trying to signal across the distance between them. Yeah, Eli said. We're ready. The barn door opened. Cold air poured in. The first birds of dawn were audible somewhere in the hollow, a thin, persistent sound, completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the clearing, doing what they did because the light was coming. The light came anyway. That was the thing about dawn in November in Harlan County. It didn't care what had happened in the dark. It arrived in its own time with its own gray indifference, coming up through the bare canopy of Caldwell Hollow in thin horizontal lines that had no warmth in them yet, just the first pale announcement that the dark was technically over. The birds continued their thin, persistent sound. Frost lay on every flat surface in the clearing. The sedan sat with its shattered windshield, catching the new light and throwing it back in scattered pieces. Grim walked out of the barn first. He stood in the cold for a moment and looked at the clearing. The tire tracks, the shell casings he could see glinting in the frost, the dark line of tree cover on the southeast edge, where two men had stood with weapons and then decided to leave. He looked at all of it with the expression of someone doing an inventory of a thing that has already happened, locking it into the sequence of things he would carry. Then he turned and started moving people. The van took Vivian and Eli and the two elderly patients. Trace drove. Nova sat in the back, her cut cheek pressed with a folded bandana she held in place without complaint, monitoring the scanner for any frequency activity around the hollow. Grim followed on his bike. Briggs had Holt in his truck, and whatever was said in that truck on the drive out of the hollow, Holt arrived at the county line looking like a man who had completed a recalculation he hadn't wanted to complete. Deputy Reyes met them at a rest stop on Route 14 just inside the state highway jurisdiction. She was 38, compact, with close-cropped natural hair and the specific economy of movement that came from years of doing high-stakes things in small spaces. She looked at the van, at Grim, at the document sleeve Milo had prepared, which Grim placed in her hands without ceremony. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at him. "How many inside?" she said. "3 from the barn. 2 are elderly, both need medical evaluation. One is a CNNA named Vivian Mercer, who's been held for 6 days. He paused. And a county oversight board member named Warren Holt, who will tell you everything you need if you can get him somewhere that Strand's people can't reach him. Reyes didn't react to the name Strand visibly. She filed it. The facility. State police should have it by now. They do. She looked at the document sleeve. How'd you find all this? An 11-year-old kid knocked on my door in a thunderstorm, Grim said, and a woman who used to bring meals to people nobody else was looking for. Reyes looked at him for another moment. She had the quality of a person who had worked in systems that failed people, and had stayed in those systems specifically to be the part that didn't fail, and who had developed over time the ability to recognize when someone had been doing the same thing from outside the system. "I'm going to need statements," she said. "I know. From everyone who was in that barn." "I know. And I'm going to need you to be available." She held his eyes. Not disappeared. "We'll be available," he said. He looked at the van. At the rest stop's fluorescent lights humming over the parking area in the pale dawn. "Let me get these people somewhere warm first." Reyes looked at the van too. Then she nodded once and stepped back and made a call, turning slightly away, her voice dropping into the efficient shorthand of someone activating a process she'd been building toward for 3 months. Grim walked back to the van. He opened the side door. Vivian Mercer looked at him from the middle seat, Eli beside her, their shoulders touching, both of them wearing the specific exhaustion of people who have been running on emergency reserves and have just been told they can stop. "There's a diner 8 miles east," Grim said. "We're going to get you coffee and food and somewhere warm to sit while the official part starts moving." He paused. "And then a hospital. For you, for the patients, for the cut on Nova's face, whether she wants to go or not." "I don't need—" Nova started from the back. "Hospital," Grim said. "Final." Vivian looked at him. She had the specific quality of someone whose mind had been working the whole time. 6 days in a room had not softened her thinking, had apparently compressed it into something harder and more precise. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the barn, across the 5 days and the distance and all of it. "The other people," she said. "The ones on the other floors. Alice Tremblay. State police have the facility sit," he said. "Every patient on every floor is being accounted for right now." She held his eyes, checking the truth of it. Then she exhaled, a long, controlled exhale, the kind a person makes when they've been holding something in a specific configuration for a very long time and are finally allowed to let the shape of it change. "Okay," she said quietly. Okay. The diner was called Patsy's, and it had been open since 5:30 a.m., the way it had been every morning for 23 years. A fact that felt like something important in the context of a night where everything else had been contingent and unstable. It had yellow Formica countertops and a pie case with 4 varieties and booths along the window wall, with torn vinyl seats repaired with electrical tape and a coffee maker behind the counter that had probably never been turned off in 2 decades. They took up 2 booths and 3 counter stools, which was most of the diner, and the woman working the counter, heavy-set, 60s, the professional warmth of someone who had been feeding strangers through difficult things for long enough that she could identify the quality of difficult without being told, looked at the group once and started a fresh pot of coffee without asking. Vivian sat in the window booth with Eli. She had both hands around a mug and she was looking at the parking lot outside and the pale dawn light coming up over the ridgeline, and she had the expression of someone experiencing something very ordinary. The specific luxury of a window, a mug, a parking lot in winter light, as if these things had weight that they'd never had before. Eli watched her. He was eating. The counter woman had brought him eggs and toast before he'd ordered them, reading something in his 11-year-old face that told her he needed food more than he needed a menu. And he was eating methodically, the way people eat when the body has taken over from the mind. And between bites he looked at his mother with the specific attention of someone who needs to keep confirming that a thing is real. She felt him looking. She turned from the window. "Stop checking," she said. "I'm not—" "You are." Her voice was rough from disuse, but the tone was fully her, fully the mother who had written his excuse notes and made grocery lists and taped an index card behind the baking soda. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at his eggs. "You went somewhere," he said, quietly. She set down the mug. She looked at her son, the 11-year-old boy who had walked 40 minutes in a storm to a door that should have terrified him, who had spent 6 days not sleeping and not eating and not stopping, who had sat in a surveillance van and organized document files and waited in a van in a clearing at 5 in the morning while people he'd known for less than a week went into a dark barn for him. "I know," she said. "I know I did." She paused. "Tell me what you did. All of it. From the beginning." He told her. He told her about the index card and the gate and the rain, about Grim opening the door and the eggs and the coffee and Nova's laptop. He told her about Milo and the Shell Company chain and Warren Holt's name on a beneficial ownership schedule. He told her about the surveillance van on the service road and the parking lights and the cargo boxes, about Sherry Boone arriving in the dark in a rusted Civic, about the phone call that came in at 11:47 p.m. and changed the shape of everything. He told her about the barn, about the moment Grim stepped back from the third stall doorway and looked across the clearing and gave a single nod. Vivian Mercer listened to all of it without interrupting once. She listened with the stillness of someone receiving something they need to receive completely, without deflection. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You went to the van," she said, "in the clearing. Nova told you to stay, and you went anyway." She said I could. "Eli." She said I could if she agreed to it. He looked at her steadily. "I needed to be there." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee, drank some, set it down. "You're going to be a problem when you're older," she said. Something in him that had been locked for 6 days cracked open. And he laughed, a short, undignified sound that surprised both of them. And she put her arm around his shoulders and pulled him against her side and held him there. And he let her, because outside the diner window, the November light was coming up cold and real over the Harlan County ridgeline, and they were both in it. Grim sat at the counter with black coffee and didn't eat. He was past the point where food registered as a relevant input. He sat and drank the coffee and let the diner's warmth do what warmth does after cold. Find the places where you've been clenching without knowing it, and ask them to stop. Briggs sat 2 stools down. There was a space between them that had been a larger space 12 hours ago and was now what it was. Still a space, but a different one. A space that had been measured and was being acknowledged rather than avoided. Briggs wrapped both hands around his mug. "You were right," he said. Grim looked at the counter. "I've been making you carry Denny for 2 years," Briggs said. "Every call you made, I put Denny on the table first." He paused. That's not fair. You weren't wrong to, Grim said. I was wrong to do it the way I did it. Briggs looked at his coffee. He wasn't your fault. He was the situation's fault. A pause. I knew that. I just needed you to keep knowing it too so that I didn't have to think about my part in it. The diner counter hummed with the fluorescent lights above it. The coffee maker gurgled through a fresh cycle. Outside, a truck went past on Route 14 with its running lights on. What was your part? Grim said. Not accusing, just asking. I was the one who said we had enough when we didn't, Briggs said. I pushed the timeline. You were the one who said to wait, and I was the one who said we couldn't. He looked at the counter. And then, when it went wrong, it was easier to let you carry it than to pick up my half. Grim was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee, set the mug down. We both carried it wrong, he said finally. That's done now. It wasn't absolution. Neither of them was looking for absolution. It was something more practical than that. A recalibration of load. Two men who'd been distributing weight badly between them agreeing to redistribute it correctly. The specific, unglamorous work of people who need to keep functioning together after something has broken and been partially repaired. Briggs drank his coffee. Grim drank his. The space between them on the counter stools held its new measurement and didn't shrink it. That was enough. The two elderly patients were taken by ambulance from the rest stop, both stable, both dehydrated, both significantly undermedicated relative to their actual care needs. The woman, whose name turned out to be Ruth, not Alice Tremblay. Alice Tremblay was found in the facility's main building, floor 3, present, and accounted for and furious that her breakfast had been delayed by the police activity. Squeezed Trace's hand before they loaded her into the ambulance and looked up at him with the clear, direct eyes of someone who had been waiting in a dark room for a very long time and wanted to look at a person while she still could. Trace held on until the EMT gently indicated they needed to move. Then he stepped back and watched the ambulance doors close and stood in the rest stop parking lot with his hands at his sides in the cold morning air, and the compass rose tattoo on his neck was visible above his collar in the thin dawn light. And he stood there long enough that Nova, walking past, put one hand briefly on his shoulder. He didn't say anything. She didn't ask him to. Ort. Reyes called at 8:47 a.m. The state police had secured Blackwater Ridge Manor. 6 staff members had been detained for questioning, including the facility administrator and the director of nursing. The hidden administrative corridor connecting the main building to the annex had been confirmed. The annex had been cleared. 3 former patients recovered, all alive, all requiring medical attention. Federal investigators were being contacted regarding the multi-state billing network. Warren Holt had been taken into protective federal custody pending his cooperation agreement, which his lawyer, a different lawyer from the Nashville firm, a lawyer who represented people in the specific situation of deciding how much to trade for how much protection, had begun negotiating before 9 a.m. Strand was a name that had apparently opened several other names, and those names had opened the specific kind of investigative door that didn't close once opened. Reyes said, in the careful language of someone who had been in law enforcement long enough to qualify every statement, the people in the barn, the woman, and the boy, they can go wherever they need to go. A pause. I'll need them back for statements, but they're free. Grim relayed this to the window booth. Vivian received it with a nod that had more information in it than most speeches. She looked at Eli. He looked at her. They looked at their half-eaten breakfast on the Formica table, in the yellow diner light, with the world outside continuing in its ordinary way. A truck, a passing car, a woman in a parking lot getting coffee from a gas station next door and checking her phone. Where do we go? Eli said. Vivian thought about this. She thought about their house and the kitchen and her coffee cup in the dish rack, washed and set out to dry for the morning she hadn't come home for. She thought about the specific smell of a place where someone has been waiting to return. Home, she said. We go home. Son, but not yet. Before home, before any of the next things, there was a moment in the diner parking lot in the late morning light that none of them planned and none of them would have known to plan for. Vivian Mercer walked out of the diner with Eli beside her. She looked across the parking lot at the group assembling for departure, at the motorcycles and the van, and the people moving around them with the easy choreography of a group that had been through something together and was on the other side of it, not unmarked but intact. She looked at Nova, who was holding a bandage to her cheek with one hand and arguing mildly with Grim about whether she needed stitches with the other. She looked at Trace, who was loading something into the van with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. She looked at Briggs, who was standing beside his truck with a cup of gas station coffee he'd acquired from somewhere, watching the road with the permanent external vigilance of a man whose interior landscape had recently shifted. She looked at all of them. These people who had worked through a night for a woman they'd never met because an 11-year-old boy had knocked on a door in a thunderstorm. She crossed the parking lot to Grim. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. He looked at her with that same cataloging expression she would later describe to Eli as the look of someone who checks what a situation is before deciding how to respond to it. She said, "You wrote your name on that card." "Yes." "You didn't know me when you did it." "I knew enough," he said. "You did right by one of ours. I return what's done right." She looked at him. She was 34 years old and she'd spent 6 days in a room with IV lines and fluorescent light and the grinding work of not losing her mind, and she was standing in a diner parking lot in the thin November sun in someone else's jacket, and she had her son beside her, and the exhaustion in her face had the quality of something that had been through fire and come out changed in ways that would take time to map. "Thank you," she said. It was 3 syllables and they had everything in them. Grim looked at her. He nodded once, clean, direct, sufficient. Then he looked at Eli. Eli was looking at him with the specific expression of a child who has grown sideways in the last 6 days. Not up, not age, something less linear than age, a kind of understanding that had been acquired at cost and sat differently than anything he'd had before. "You gonna be okay?" Grim said. "Yeah," Eli said. "You need anything?" "I know where the door is," Eli said. Something moved in Grim's face, small and quick and real. "Yeah," he said. "You do." What? The federal investigation took 14 months. Strand's real name was David Merritt, a nephew of the law firm's founding partner, which explained the shell company structure and the legal insulation. He was indicted in 4 states on charges that included organized healthcare fraud, unlawful restraint, and conspiracy to obstruct official proceedings. 16 people connected to the billing network were charged, including 3 county officials in 2 different counties and a state licensing board administrator who had been taking quarterly payments routed through a shell entity for 6 years. Warren Holt pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges in month 8 of the investigation. His cooperation agreement resulted in a reduced sentence and relocation out of Harlan County to somewhere that nobody in the clubhouse discussed, because nobody particularly cared where Warren Holt ended up as long as it was away. Alice Tremblay, 82, was transferred, an actual transfer, to an actual facility, this one with no phantoms in its records, and her family visited her the following Sunday and every Sunday after that. She sent a card to the Iron Vultures MC Clubhouse in December. It contained no message, only her name signed in the careful cursive of someone who'd been taught to write in a different era. They taped it to the wall above the bar counter and left it there. Sherry Boone's name appeared in no official documents. Reyes had made that possible through the specific navigational skill of someone who understood which pieces of a case needed to be visible and which could be protected. Sherry had a daughter and a different route to the grocery store and a job at a medical billing firm in Lexington now, where she was, by all accounts, extraordinarily difficult to deceive. Detective Lena Cross had her suspension reversed in the 2nd month of the investigation, when the internal affairs complaint against her was found to have been filed using falsified evidence originating from Holt's office. She sent Grim a text message that consisted of 3 words: "You were right." He read it and put his phone back in his pocket and went back to what he'd been doing, which was rebuilding the carburetor on an '84 Sportster he'd been restoring for 6 months. But Vivian went back to work. Not to Blackwater Ridge. That building was sealed, its license revoked, its patient census redistributed to facilities that had survived the investigation's examination. She went to the Harlan County Medical Center, days this time, a staff CNA position that paid less per hour than nights at the manor had, but which let her be home before Eli's school day ended. She bought a new coffee cup. She left the old one in the dish rack where it had been since the morning she hadn't come home, and eventually she washed it and put it in the cabinet, and that was its own kind of ceremony, even if she didn't think of it in those terms. Eli went back to school. His teachers, who had received the call from the woman claiming to be his aunt, asked no questions. His English teacher gave him an extension on an essay he hadn't started. He wrote it eventually, about the water cycle, which was the assigned topic. Though he wrote about it in a way that suggested he understood something about cycles in general that most 11-year-olds hadn't had cause to think through. He went back to the clubhouse for the first time on a Saturday in early December. He didn't call ahead. He walked through the gate, across the gravel, past the motorcycles under the corrugated overhang, and knocked on the door the same way he'd knocked the first time. Flat-palmed and deliberate, like he meant it. Trace opened it. He looked at Eli. Then he stepped back without saying anything, the same way a door held open doesn't need to announce itself. The clubhouse was the same. Amber light, the smell of coffee and leather, the dog in the corner registering his arrival with a brief ear raise and then returning to its professional commitment to sleep. A card game paused, a football game on mute, the specific warm and rough texture of a room full of people who don't perform comfort but generate it anyway through the fact of their presence. Grim was at the bar counter with his back to the room. He turned when Eli came in. He looked at the boy the way he'd looked at him the first night. At him, not through him, the full, undeflected attention of someone who had decided a long time ago that people deserved to be actually seen. Eli was carrying a cardboard box. Inside it were canned goods, soup, beans, corn, tomatoes, which he set on the table without ceremony. "My mom said you do a food drive," he said. "We do," Grim said. "I want to help with it." Grim looked at him. He looked around the room, at Trace, at Briggs standing in the doorway with his coffee, at Nova at her usual spot by the window with her laptop, the narrow scar along her cheek now a clean line, pale and settled, the way scars settle when they're properly healed. He looked at all of them, these people, damaged, functional, carrying their various weights in their various ways. None of them what the world expected when it thought about a room full of people with skull patches on their leather vests. He looked back at Eli. "There's a list of collection sites on the counter," he said. "You can start there." Eli found the list. He read it. He pulled a chair up to the table and sat down with the focused, unhurried purposefulness of someone who has found a place and is occupying it, not visiting it. Grim watched him for a moment. Then he turned back to the counter and picked up his coffee and said nothing else. Because nothing else needed to be said. The door was open. The boy was inside. The list was on the counter, and the work was waiting, and the amber light was the same amber light it had always been, warm and rough and sufficient. Outside, Harley sat quiet in the cold December air. The neon sign above the door buzzed its low electric note, red-orange in the gray afternoon. Somewhere down Depot Road, a car passed, and its sound faded, and the road went quiet again. The wind came in off the ridge with the specific patience of things that don't need to hurry, that have been doing what they do through every season this country has had, that will keep doing it long after everyone inside and outside this building has finished whatever they came here to do. Inside the Iron Vulture's clubhouse, a boy sat at a table with a food drive list and a pen. A woman with a scar on her cheek typed something that needed typing. A man who rebuilt carburetors and carried old mistakes and opened doors to kids in storms drank his coffee in the amber light. A dog slept in the corner. A card game resumed. The world outside was the same world it had been the night of the storm. Cold, indifferent, full of systems that failed people and officials who served themselves in distances that swallowed the ones you loved whole. None of that had changed. None of it was ever going to fully change. But inside this specific building, on this specific Saturday in December, there was coffee, and there was light, and there was a door that had been decided, not declared, not announced, just decided, the way the important things are decided, to stay open. That was enough. That was everything.